50 years ago this year, the young inventor Marconi, half Italian, half British, who had already startled the world with his wireless telegraphy between ships and shore, announced that he had succeeded in sending signals across the Atlantic from Poldhu in Cornwall to St. John's in Newfoundland. Only 5 or 6 years had elapsed since the days when he was first able to ring a bell attached to his receiver by sending a signal from a transmitter a mere 40 or 50 yards away in the family garden at Bologna. It is a curious thought that the apparatus he used for sending a mere 50 yards, without any modification or alteration of position, could very possibly now send signals which could be heard in America in the daytime, owing to the wonderful developments that have since taken place. But those developments were a long way ahead, and in the meantime the young genius went on making his sending apparatus more and more powerful, until with receivers hardly any different to those he used in his home, he was able to span the Atlantic. Let us hear what he has to say about this historic step.
In December 1901, I was able for the first time, by means of stations specially constructed for that purpose, to transmit and receive telegraphic signals right across the Atlantic Ocean, from Poldhu in Cornwall to St. John's, Newfoundland, a distance of about 1,800 miles. Early in 1902, during a voyage on the American liner Philadelphia to New York, I was able to receive signals from Poldhu in Cornwall for the whole distance at night time, although during the day the transmission range fell to 700 miles. I was thus able to discover the now well-known fact that wireless signals transmitted by wavelengths of a few hundred meters can be received over much greater distances by night than during the hours of daylight.
Shortly after these sensational events, I was fortunate enough to get taken on as a junior engineer with the Marconi Company at 10 shillings a week and all found. I was strongly advised against this step on my part by my college professors. And among scientists generally at that time, there were many attempts at debunking Marconi's efforts. Actually, the scientists missed the boat, and my voyage on that boat during the following 35 years was like one wonderful dream, with hardly a moment without some new phenomena or some new success to thrill one. In about 1906, my interest was rather centered on the idea of transmitting speech by wireless, and we had succeeded in talking over a distance of a few miles. Marconi came to see the experiments, and from that time I became personally associated with him, an ambition which I had had from the beginning. In those early days in Italy, Marconi's experiments mystified and probably at times irritated his family. His mother told me that on one occasion he broke her bathroom thermometer to her slight annoyance to make a coherer which was the forerunner of the crystal. His excuse to her was that he had a great invention which would make him famous. Eventually the family sent the young man off to England, where he arrived with his mysterious black boxes. Here the fact that his mother came from a well-known Dublin family and that he had powerful relatives in Britain was of great assistance to him. In addition, he spoke excellent English, and you will probably have noticed that his speech was of a rather unusual musical character. In England, he was able to give demonstrations to the chief engineer of the post office, and through him he got to know Sir Ambrose Fleming, who was later to do so much for radio by inventing the thermionic valve. Sir Ambrose says,
I made acquaintance with Mr. Marconi in April 1896 when I was on holiday at Bournemouth, and he was working his wireless telegraphy between the Isle of Wight and Bournemouth, and he invited me to go and see it. And I have not yet forgotten my surprise when I received a message sent to me by Maxwell waves 12 miles oversea, printed down in dot and dash on paper tape, saying compliments to Professor Fleming. Marconi then shifted his station to the South Foreland Lighthouse near Dover and made a receiving station near Boulogne in France and sent his wireless messages across the English Channel. And this created a great sensation.
But Marconi had already foreseen something much bigger. He had always believed that wireless waves would follow the curvature of the Earth, and he determined to find out if he was right. A very large wireless station was erected at Poldhu in Cornwall. Many difficulties had to be contended with. The first 4 masts erected collapsed in a storm, and a temporary pair had to be put up for the great test to come. New problems had to be solved in getting more power than ever before to the aerials, and Fleming's engineering knowledge was of great assistance in that direction. Marconi then crossed the Atlantic with his 2 assistants, Messrs. Paget and Capt, and they decided to receive from Poldhu at St. John's, Newfoundland, the nearest point to England. The site chosen was a historic one, at the Cabot Tower, at the entrance to St. John's Harbour. They had taken with them balloons and kites to hold the aerial up with, but the weather nearly beat them. Paget gives some idea of their difficulties.
But the weather was terrible, and for a couple of days we battled with the elements. One of the balloons being carried away by the gale, which snapped the heavy mooring rope like a piece of cotton. So Mr. Marconi suggested that for his crucial test on the 3rd day, we should use kites. And on that morning, we managed to fly a kite up to 400 feet. It flew out over the stormy Atlantic, surging up and down in the gale and tugging at its 600 feet of aerial wire. The icy rain slashed my face as I watched anxiously. The wind howled around the building, where in a small dark room furnished with a table, 1 chair and some packing cases, Mr. Capt sat at the simple receiving set, while Mr. Marconi drank a cup of cocoa before taking his turn at listening for the signals which were being transmitted from Poldhu. At least we hoped so.
And their hopes were justified, for Marconi says,
It was shortly after midday, on December the 12th, 1901, that I placed a single earphone to my ear and started listening. The receiver on the table before me was very crude. A few coils and condensers and a coherer. No valves, no amplifiers, not even a crystal. I was at last on the point of putting the correctness of all my beliefs to test. The experiment had involved risking at least £50,000 to achieve a result which had been declared to be impossible by some of the principal mathematicians of the time. The chief question was whether wireless waves would be stopped by the curvature of the Earth. All along I had been convinced that this was not so, but some eminent men held that the roundness of the Earth would prevent communication over such a great distance as across the Atlantic. The first and final answer to that question came at 12:30, when I heard
the letter S in Morse, clearly and unmistakably all the way over the Atlantic, from Poldhu in Cornwall to the desolate and exposed experimental receiving station in St. John's, Newfoundland. These tests had begun with the letter S because it is one of the easiest to send with high power. A few years later, when Marconi had greatly improved the Poldhu transmitter, he set out for Nova Scotia to see whether he could receive whole messages in Morse on the mainland of America. This time he was accompanied not only by his assistants, but also by his wife and her sister, the Honourable Eileen O'Brien, who remembers very clearly what it was like.
An electric storm of great severity then broke over our bungalow and station, so much so that Marconi again came to tell us he could hear nothing and seemed in despair. My sister and I tried to encourage him, and I asked him to return to the station and come and relate any results in about an hour. I prayed to know that God's voice could be heard over continent and ocean to Earth's remotest bounds, that nothing could obstruct or delay this result. He returned in about 3/4 of an hour to tell us of his success. His face revealed this. No words could describe his joy. that he had heard messages distinctly from Poldew Station in Cornwall, and would we come and listen in at once. We all went to the station, and in a few moments I had heard what to me sounded like a great buzzing noise, like a gnat, in the headphones. But the engineers all knew, of course, its meaning. On this famous day, July 15th, 1907, one of the chief engineers, Mr. P.J. Woodward, wrote down for me on 2 scraps of paper — Marconigrams were not then in being — these 2 original messages, which are now in the Science Museum, South Kensington, with other relics of Marconi's work. The first message reads, "Marconi Station, Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, July 15th, 1907. Latest news bulletin from Poldew Station, Cornwall. 100 strikers cycled into Pretoria to demand the passing of the arbitration bill. The Premier refused. The deputation withdrew, repudiating all responsibility of possible bloodshed." The second message reads, "Marconi Station, Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, July the 15th, 1907. Telegram received from Poldew Station, Cornwall. London, to Mason, steamship La Provence. Love from all, Jack in particular, Orchie."
These tests were only the beginning of a long 20-year struggle, and Marconi considered that he had not really succeeded until the day, at the end of that time, he linked up the Empire and afterwards the whole world with his beam system. In 1935, he said to Paget,
Well, Paget, after all, from my earliest experiments, I had always held a belief, amounting almost to an intuition, that radio signals would someday be sent across the greatest distances. I now knew that all my anticipations had been justified. The electric waves sent out into space from Poldew had traversed the Atlantic, the distance, enormous as it seemed then, of 1,700 miles, unimpeded by the curvature of the Earth. The result meant much more to me than the mere successful realization of an experiment. As Sir Oliver Lodge has stated, it was an epoch in history. I now felt for the first time absolutely certain that the day would come when mankind could be able to send messages without wires, not only across the Atlantic, but between the furthermost ends of the Earth.
One cannot doubt that into the future Marconi's name will stand out as the man who lit the flame, the radiation from which illuminated not only the domain he undertook to light, but innumerable other domains as well. For the struggle to develop wireless brought about many inventions which have aided almost every art and science. And now I am going to give the last word to his sister-in-law.
I do not suppose anyone can know what it meant to him, nor the nature of his gratitude to God. But to the world and to those who knew him intimately, his life work was a grand example to us and to all future generations. It would be impossible for anyone thinking intelligently not to realize in some degree the vastness of Marconi's work for humanity, and with what ease and security we live on land, sea, and air, since this great man lived and died